Welcome everyone to the Starting Points podcast that can be found on our YouTube channel, education channel. And tonight we're lucky enough to have a repeat performance by Pat Obst, who is a practitioner at the Starting Point. She is a licensed clinical social worker, and her specialty is grief and loss. And another specialty is she treats a number of her clients who have lost children. Pat knows and helps, I would say hundreds at this point. Should we add it to thousands now, Pat? I mean, how long have you been practicing?
Over 20 years.
Okay, so I guess we got to use the 1,000 number, right? So we're very lucky to have her today to talk about ambiguous loss. My name is Loretta Depka, and I have the privilege of being the executive director here at the Starting Point. So please visit our website. You'll see the little YouTube symbol at the top of our website that will take you right to our education channel. You can also visit Vince's corner, which will give you lectures that Vince DePasquale has done for years. So everyone, welcome. And without further ado, let's start the conversation with Pat about ambiguous loss. So Pat, what is ambiguous loss?
Okay, so sometimes I'll say ambiguous loss, sometimes I'll just say AL, just because ambiguous loss is a mouthful. Actually, in the 1970s, and you'll see me look off to the side just because I have notes, Dr. Pauline Boss, she's the one who coined this term as it's a kind of loss where there's no clear closure or understanding of maybe what or why something happened. You'll see that sometimes in like suicide, you know, why did they do it? And the person's kind of at a loss for answers. It leaves people searching for, you know, the whys, the whats, the hows. There's a delay in the process of grieving because of that. And often it can result in a chronic kind of grief because people are just kind of hanging out there in limbo. You know, we as human beings, we like situations to be somewhat in our control. We don't feel safe if we don't have a level of control over things. And so the ambiguity makes us feel unsafe. And that's part of why it's so uncomfortable. Now, both of these things, they can cause a denial of the impact of grief. You know, when you don't have answers, when there's too much left, you know, too many loose ends, then a lot of times people will just go back to work. You know, they'll just bury themselves in work and not really try to process through things because they think that they can't. They think that there's no answers. And now we don't necessarily disconnect from the ones we love just because they've died. We still feel love for them. We still feel like we can hear them or touch them through, you know, the things that they have. We also sometimes don't connect with people just because they're physically here. Couples can be completely disconnected in the same house. So those two things are also part of the ambiguity, where there's a physical presence, but an emotional loss, or there's an emotional presence and a physical loss. And that's what makes it ambiguous. And then this creates all kinds of anxiety, depression, all those kinds of things that happen when we're really stuck. Two main types of ambiguous loss are that physical absence with the emotional presence. Physical absence would be if somebody's missing, like a soldier is missing in action. Adoption, where the adoptee knows that the parent is alive, the birth parent is alive, but they're not physically there. The absent parent, you know, the parents get divorced and one of the parents like never shows up for things. natural disasters and you don't know where someone is. Even the empty nest syndrome, where, okay, you know you have children, but they're all across the country at college and whatnot. So that's that physical absence with still there's a psychological connection. The opposite is a physical presence with a psychological absence. So that's like an Alzheimer's, a stroke. They're physically there, but not emotionally there and connected. So see how there's a disconnection at one end or the other. There's unanswered questions and that sort of thing.
And you bring up, you know, as someone suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's, it must be incredibly difficult for, say, the spouse or the adult child who's taking care of the parent to have time to even figure out what they're feeling.
Right, to process that, because they have to live in kind of two worlds. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, you know, a present world and the impending, like you said, if somebody has Alzheimer's, there's also this impending thing out there that's going to happen. So when people experience this, there becomes this barrier to coping and to grieving. It kind of stops that process. I'll give you some examples of those kinds of when there's not. I have a client whose daughter was murdered. She still to this day, 11 years later, doesn't know the answer to who the murderer was.
Oh.
But she's been able to, I'll talk about it a little further on, she's been able to move forward with her life, even though that's a big, gigantic, unanswered question, right? So how do we do that? And people get stuck because they're looking for answers or they're looking for closure and feel like they can't move on. And so I'm going to talk about how they can, even though they don't have everything tied up in a bow.
It must be so difficult for them to get out of bed in the morning. I mean, you know, I think it's one thing when, you know, someone actually dies, but to have them present and not with you or know where they are or to function must be incredibly difficult.
Well, and in the beginning, especially, of course, people are going to, you have to let them reel in all that and to have as many questions and as much confusion as there is. You can't stop that. You can't just rationalize that away. And that's often what people try to do. You know, I let my clients, my grief clients, ask why and woulda, coulda, shoulda for the first year. I don't even stop them. I just let them say it every single session if they need to, because they need to wrestle with that. One of the things that comes into play with ambiguous loss is ambivalence. And that's really feeling conflicted about emotions that seem at odds with one another. So if you think of ambiguous loss as it's sort of like there's a physical presence with an emotional loss or the opposite, right? But then there's also the unanswered questions and the lack of closure. That's ambiguous loss. Ambivalence is when there's sort of two things going on at one time. Some phrases that give that example are, I wish my missing soldier spouse would be found and come home, but what kind of mental state are they going to be in when they get here? I wish my dad would show up when he promises, but will he be drunk when he does? I want my mother to be out of the misery of suffering from Alzheimer's, but I don't want her to die. It's those
Wow.
two kind of opposing perspectives going on at the same time. And again, that can get people stuck because they're looking for a straight line, right?
Absolutely. And exhausted from fighting within.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I always tell people, you know, it's the struggle that'll kill you. It's
That's the truth, isn't it?
within. So what's good is that people have done work around this and what some of the key guidelines are in order to build resilience, to be able to live within this, despite the ambiguity and the ambivalence. I tell a lot of my clients, I said, once you get to a certain age, you have to learn that joy and misery coexist. And really, we forget that a lot of us are living in ambiguity anyway, and we don't even realize it, even if it's not lost. Do we have, all of us here, do all of us have all the loose ends tied up in our lives? Whether it be our financial life, our relationship life, our work life, do we have all the, Loretta,
It would be boring, Pat, if we had it all done.
do you have all the paperwork on your desk done?
No, and it keeps on growing.
Right. So we have to realize that we live in that and begin to trust that, wait a minute, I am capable of living with two opposing things going on at the same time. I am capable of living with loose ends. Now, it seems like we can't when it's a really intense, like a loss. But part of how we handle a loss is our resilience and our trust in that we've done these things before. There's a book called Ambiguous Loss and Grief in Psychotherapy. It's by Haley Hirschman, PhD. And these are some of the things that he describes as those guidelines. Now, these are general guidelines. I'm going to talk a little bit more about how all this applies to COVID in the end. So finding meaning is one of those resilient elements. And that's making sense of the loss without necessarily all the answers. We can name the problem. We can call it ambiguous, right? Give it a name. We can talk with peers who are experiencing some of the same things, rather than feeling like we're in a vacuum. We can use both and thinking rather than either or, black and white. That's what gets us in trouble a lot of times. We can begin to let go of having to know, because it's really hard to find meaning when we're stuck and we need answers, as opposed to we need ideas about how to move on. We can do small good works. We can continue family rituals and celebrations, but maybe change them up. Again, it doesn't have to be an either or. I have people who they'll do with the holidays in the first year, I say, you might keep everything the same. You might keep nothing the same. You might keep some things the same. Figure the first and second year are transition years. You're going to settle into new rituals and traditions a few years out. Let these be transition years. See, people want a definitive, we're going to do this. No, it might morph and change over the next couple of years before you settle back into, okay, these are our traditions. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
Also, we have to look at what can hinder finding meaning. Hate, seeking revenge, seeking retribution, keeping family secrets, isolating.
Oh, that's a bad one.
Seeking closure at all costs. Okay? I won't whatever until I find out whatever. That kind of thinking. The next thing he touches on is adjusting mastery, and that's modifying that desire for control and certainty. People who either have OCD or struggle with anxiety, they're going to have a hard time with this part, but it's part of their growth process, is being able to not be totally in control, because we think when we have the answers, we're in control, right? So recognizing that the world is not always fair. Decreasing blame of self and blame of others. That's victim mode. When we're blaming other people and we're blaming ourselves, that's victim mode. And see, if we're too into finding answers and creating that closure, it's going to be easier to latch on to it's her fault or it's his fault, because it feels like it gives us an answer. See, but that keeps us in victim mode, that blame of self or blame of others. Managing and making decisions about things that we can control. Because when you're in ambiguous loss, there's a lot you can't control. So honing in on those, the smallest of things. I tell people, be mindful. When you pick out your clothes that morning, that's something you can control. You can control what you're going to wear. You can control what you're going to eat for breakfast. You can control whether you go to the Target or the Walmart. Say, they're so big on trying to control the answers about the big thing. You need to bring it in to the littlest things and start to gain a sense of control there and a sense of being grounded there. Do things that will increase our feeling of success and experiences. You know, plant a garden so that you can feel like, oh, I did something that I have some control over something and there's a positive outcome. So that's something that can kind of counter some of those feelings too. Accepting what will not change. Serenity prayer, right, Vince? I mean, that is this is universal and it's forever, right?
Absolutely.
That sentiment. So again, like what can hinder this mastery? If we believe that we've failed. Okay, if we believe that we failed because we didn't fix it or because we didn't figure it out. You know, have parents with so much woulda, coulda, shoulda that if we see that our decisions along the way were a failure because somebody died or, you know, whatever the loss is, then we can remain stuck too. That's part of the reason why I have people pull out the lens and see all the factors and all the context when there's a loss and see that they're only a small part of it, but yet they try to take on all of it.
And Pat, how does somebody who loves someone suffering with ambiguous loss help them? You know, that's our first reaction, because I imagine if someone's struggling for a couple years, there's a point in time when people, as with regular grief, get frustrated and say you need to get over it.
Mm-hmm.
How do you really help somebody work through their loss?
Well, if it's been a few years, I think one of the things is to help the person recognize that they're stuck. And then gently and lovingly guide them to making them aware that, you know, it's not, they're not weak, they're not, you know, solely to blame, that they are in a place where this is a situation they need to validate, acknowledge and validate that it's a difficult situation. And it's human to be stuck in something like that. And there are people who can help you get unstuck, and encouraging them that then whether it's reading certain books, whether it's listening to podcasts or lectures, whether it's going to a therapist. Like some people will go online and just kind of dabble and read some things first before they would like go to a therapist. So if somebody doesn't feel that open to that, just ask them to read a little bit of this or a little bit of that and say, figure out what you think it might mean for you. Decide from there whether or not you want to take a next step of going to a therapist or going to a support group. You just kind of have to get their toe in the water. Sometimes people just, they try to throw them in the pool. Go to therapy.
Right.
Just say, you know what? I think you're kind of stuck. Let's kind of explore what that means, why that is.
Well, it's almost like, at least ambiguous loss is harder to accept if you're watching someone go through it. You want them to get that. Well, I guess it is the same as grief, but it's just because it's ambiguous, it's a little ambiguous, right?
It's complicated. See, complicated grief takes longer. And sometimes just helping somebody acknowledge and validate that, you know what you're going through is really complicated. It's
Right.
not something that's going to be over in, generally uncomplicated grief is 6 months to a year. It's not something that's going to be over that quickly. And then the other acknowledgement and validation is that, and a lot of people will admit, they'll say, I'm stuck. And say, all right, well, when we're stuck, it's usually because there's something in the way. Professionals are the ones who can help us figure that out. Or, let's look and see if there are some books that kind of address what you're going through. Maybe do it with them together. Let's sit here and go on Amazon and,
Right.
and Google ambiguous loss or Google complicated grief. Say, and just get them open to it. And then let the professionals take it from there. It's not a good idea to become somebody's therapist. But certainly to become their ally and their friend, to maybe hold their hand on the way to there.
That's great advice.
So, some other things that this author mentions are another way to deal with ambiguous loss is reconstructing identity, knowing who you are now, accepting that you're different now, that you'll never be the same. Right. But that people want to go backwards. And we used to say in the afterwards program that the word back is a 4-letter dirty word. Because we can't go back. We can only go forward. And all the woulda, coulda, shouldas keep us backwards. Where if we look instead at when we're trying to find answers, even a lot of times that's backwards, isn't it? We're trying to find answers to why somebody committed suicide. And if I only knew, well, what you're really saying is if I only knew, I could stop it. Well, but it's done. You can't stop it. But the brain doesn't want to get there. And so helping somebody to reconstruct that identity of, you can't go back. This is who you are now. This is what has happened. How can we move forward? And when it comes to the loss of people, a lot of times, one of the things that I'll use to encourage people to move forward is, what is the best way to honor your loved one's life? Is what you're doing with woulda, coulda, shoulda, and being stuck, and then being miserable with everybody else in your life. Is that honoring the beauty of their life? I have a woman whose son had cerebral palsy, recently died in his 20s. And this was 2 years ago. And she's just now contacting me. This is 2 years later, because she's stuck. She's stuck in the woulda, coulda, shouldas of his hospitalization in the end, and all of that. And so, well, how is that? I want you to explain to me, how is that honoring your son's life? Because she started telling me all kinds of wonderful stories about him and his beautiful smile and all this. I said, how is you going back to the woulda, coulda, shouldas, honoring that? And she got it,
Right.
right? So that's part of how you can, you know, as people begin to reconstruct that identity, that can help. And what can hinder that is when you're resisting that kind of change, when you're disconnecting and isolating from everyone because you feel so different now. Say that, you know, I'm not the way I used to be, so now I'm not going to connect with the people I used to connect with. Now I'm not going to be I can't be myself. And it's all because they're stuck.
Right.
So once you get people unstuck, they're able to re-engage in life again. But they have to give it a name. They have to accept their new identity. As I say, to my grieving mothers, I say, you're going to have to know grieving mothers for the rest of your life. So go to support groups, talk to your friends who have lost a child. You are going to have in your life grieving mothers for the rest of your days, because you need other people who will identify with you, and you'll identify with them, and you can be free to be who you are. I have a person who, Comfort Club was a group that used to be in this area. It was run by one of the priests in one of the parishes, and a lot of the women became friends, and then the priest who ran it moved away, so it doesn't meet anymore. But like there's 3 or 4 of those women who continue to meet, and not on a regular basis as a support group, but they'll like go to lunch, and sometimes they'll talk about their children and sometimes they won't, but they know that they can at any moment, and they'll all understand, and they'll all you know, nobody feels uncomfortable. And so if you don't embrace that new identity, you see how you could stay stuck.
Absolutely.
And you wouldn't connect with other people. So that's part of how you get beyond this ambiguous loss as well.
I can't imagine how people managed that ambiguous loss through COVID, through lockdown. I mean, talk about needing other people.
Right.
It's just a really interesting dilemma.
So I did find an article, believe it or not, on
No way.
the pandemic. Yes. And here's part of what it says. It says it's a global pervasive sense of loss that is tied to changes in daily routines, missing out on planned celebrations, being physically separated from friends and family. The kind of grief we're experiencing is especially challenging because it is in reaction to the ambiguity of losing more intangible parts of our lives. For example, many of us are no longer able to cleanly divide work from home, right? Or paid time from playtime. There's some of that ambivalence too. You got 2 opposing things.
Absolutely.
We don't know what is safe and what is not. And almost more so now. Do I shake somebody's hand? Do I not? Do I wear my mask? Do I not? Because some of the guidelines have changed.
Do
right?
we keep the precautions at starting point in place or not? We have had that conversation every day since the CDC came down with the lake.
Yes, yes. We don't know what activities to plan or cancel. And I know somebody who's rescheduled their wedding twice. And there's that, and that's a sense of loss. You know, everybody was excited, and no, we gotta wait. And then everybody gets, no, we gotta wait. And that's what can, again, get people stuck because they're, well, I can't go on with my life until the wedding. Well, no, there's other ways you can go on with your life while you're waiting for the wedding. We're unable to predict what's coming next, so it's hard to plan, you know, for the future. So let's say somebody right before the pandemic, had plans to open a restaurant. Well, now they can say, well, I think I can open a restaurant now, but should I? And it's all this stop and start. And of course, there's the big one is people who've experienced loss during the pandemic.
Right.
Whether it's divorce, I have people who would have been divorced a year ago, right? So they're really experiencing that the person is here physically, but we are emotionally disconnected, right? But yet,
Did anybody get back together being locked down?
I have to think about that. One couple possibly.
There you go.
But then, of course, deaths, right? I have someone who lost her husband. He was in the hospital for 3 weeks with COVID and died. What she wants is she wants to meet the nurse who was by his side in the end. She says, I don't even care if we talk. I just want to know who she is. So it's okay for us to try to get as many answers as we can and as much closure as we can. The problem is when we say, I can't move on until I get those things. Janice is a perfect example. My client whose daughter was murdered. She's somebody who has managed to recreate her life in a beautiful way since that loss without knowing who the murderer was. A lot of times people get stuck on the justice thing. Until I get justice,
Right.
I can't move on. Again, those two things have to coexist. I can recreate my life and not know who murdered my daughter. She's able to have those two things in one space. It's difficult to do. It took a lot of work. But now,
she did the work, and good for her.
exactly. So, with COVID, there's no clear end to it even now. So it would be really foolish for us to wait to do different things in our life. I get certain things you couldn't travel until they opened up the airlines. Certain things you can't. But now, especially as things are opening up a little bit anyway, it's really important that people not live in that kind of fear of what if this and what if that. You know what, for today, if you can book a flight to somewhere, book a flight. We can't sustain the ambiguity. And so we have to begin to move on. Because otherwise, that's why you have people who totally isolate. That's why you have people who get into a deep, deep depression. That's why you have people.
That's why mental health is, just
Mm-hmm.
the numbers are staggering of what's going on.
Right. So she talks a little bit in that article about that sometimes we can't use the usual coping strategies that we would to connect with others or to do the self-care. So, the people who would normally go to the gym, what is resilience? Resilience is adaptability and flexibility. So people who would normally go to the gym, they had to learn to work out at home. In fact, I tried to get weights for my son in the beginning of the pandemic and I couldn't get them because
I tried to buy a bike. That was tough.
But so what do? You do calisthenics. Calisthenics is using the body as the weight. And right,
absolutely.
There's always a way is what you have to develop. Again, that gets away from the black and white thinking.
But it's hard. I think the hardest thing is moving forward, life is not going to be the same. It's going to be different. So this whole idea of looking back at how we used to do things isn't going to be how we do them moving forward, is it?
No, no. And that's where we have to be creative and flexible. We have to learn to work with the circumstance rather than against it. And so if we're looking for specific answers, if we're looking for specific closure, we're going to stay stuck. We have to work with what we have, right? Another thing she says is to name the feelings, and we talked a little bit about that, and see that the ambiguity is the enemy, not each other. I'm sure a lot of people were at each other's throats this past year. Right?
I suspect that's true.
and with the couples, a lot of times, and this is from another kind of like couples therapy, where they talk about that the issue, whatever the issue is, and in this case, or this past year, the ambiguity that we were living in, is the enemy, not each other. And what happens is we start to make each other the enemy, instead of saying, wait a minute, it's this thing that we're dealing with. It's the enemy, not us. So let's fight it together instead of fighting each other. She talks about sharing your ambivalence, with others. And we were all in the same boat. So you've got to, again, if you isolate, you're not going to have that connection with other people, even if it has to be online, to know that you're not alone in it. She said, express that you hate being at home, but love spending more time with your family, feeling glad your family is safe, but sad that others are dying. So there again is that living with two opposing emotions and feelings and circumstance at the same time. Well, just seeing what we've already kind of talked about. People are lazy about developing discernment, awareness and discernment. When we're aware of what we're feeling, of our intuition, then we can use some discernment and make choices. Too often we would rather look back, woulda, coulda, shoulda, or dig our heels in about, I need to know the answers and that sort of thing, rather than being aware of how we're feeling and using discernment to make some choices about where we're going to go from here. We want those choices to be made for us, instead of saying, just because I don't have the answer doesn't mean I can't move on. If we're aware that we're getting depressed because we're so stuck in the woulda, coulda, shoulda, then we need to say, I need to do things differently. But instead, we're waiting for answers. We need to pay attention to what we're feeling and then discern what we need to do to move forward. We don't want to discern. We want the answers to be handed to us. So discernment is a big part of it as well. And that means, kind of getting a feel for and knowing ourselves. Again, if we're looking outwards and we're pointing our finger at everybody else, we're not going to know ourselves. And we can't make the best choices. Notice what is still present from your pre-COVID life. See your resilience, what you are still doing well despite the stress. What positive new things have you discovered about yourself and your family? Where are you thriving? And share those discoveries with other people. You have your victim mode people who are going to complain about everything, right?
Right.
You have other people who are going to, and that's not necessarily being optimistic, it's being realistic. It's saying, yeah, this stinks, but this is pretty good.
Perfect example is how I feel about Zoom.
Okay.
I can't stand it. However, it's kept us connected and I'm thrilled. But
Right.
I'm so tired of screens.
Right.
No offense, anyone here.
We don't take them. Doing small activities that you know you can accomplish in order to soften those feelings of being out of control. When we don't have answers, when we're in that ambiguity, we feel out of control. So doing anything that makes us feel like chaos is not in every corner of our lives is helpful. And of course, you know, remembering that we're universally grieving, that we're not alone. New routines and rituals and norms will come out of this, right? That's that post-traumatic growth. New businesses will be created
Absolutely.
out of this. New technologies, new medical advances. You know, there's other things that will come out of it. And the same way with our individual loss. When people get stuck in the, I need answers, there's no closure, and don't see that, you know what, sometimes we can use just the grief. Just take the grief. You're wide open, right? You are an open wound. Sometimes it's actually an opportunity. We call it the gift in the ugly package. Sometimes it's the opportunity to heal old wounds that, because we've been busy with life and life's just kind of bubbling along, we haven't dealt with. So often, if people stick in there with me long enough in grief therapy, not only are they grieving, healing, recreating their lives after loss, they're evolving, because they're not only cleaning out the stuff in the front of the refrigerator, they're going all the way to the back of the refrigerator and getting out all that old, stinky, moldy stuff, if they're willing. And it's amazing to see that. Now, some people it's too much and they can only handle the loss in front of them. But quite often, people are willing to clear out a lot of stuff. And it's given them that opportunity because, hey, you know what? I'm already an open wound. I might as well just clean everything out. So that's part of what we can do when we don't stay stuck in that one loss and that one set of answers and that justice and all that. And we move from there. So, you know, in the end, it's not about either or, black and white, all the loose ends being tied up, you know, the closure as we expect it to be. My dad died last March, and we had a small, you know, family funeral for him, but not, you know, a life celebration. He was 87 years old. So, you know, he did a lot in his life. He had a lot of people that he touched. So we're going to have it now in October. So yeah, that was sad at first that we couldn't do that. But actually by having more time, we've been able to, like, I've been able to really go through other pictures that had everything happen, boom, 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 right away. I probably would have forgotten, you know, some pictures, some stories, things like that. But now I've had time to remember those things and pull those things up so that I'll be able to share more at his life celebration than I would have had it just happen, because I've been able to reflect.
Right.
And that's how you adapt. That's how you adapt. rather than, oh, well, it should have been this way. It should have been that way.
Those shouldas kill you, don't they?
We should all over ourselves. And so, it's about grieving, healing, recreating our life after loss, even in the midst of the ambiguity. We can't let that stop us. That's what it does. It keeps us stuck. And if we're aware, then we can move that obstacle out of the way, and actually be able to move on, like Janice did, who now has a wonderful family, never thought she would have grandchildren, and because her only daughter, it was her only child who died, married a wonderful man, lives on a lake out in the middle of the country, and is retired, has lots of friends, and because he has a daughter, she's got grandchildren. But if she decided not to move on with her life until she found out who murdered her daughter, guess where she'd be right now?
Absolutely, right where she was.
Yeah. But she allowed those two things to coexist. And that's the real answer to dealing with ambiguous loss.
Well, Pat, that's a great place to end. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you doing this again for our audience, and you will be on our YouTube education channel very shortly. And next week's topic is, what is mindfulness? So we hope you'll all join us, and thank you so much, Pat. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.